when you're struggling with these symptoms and this kind of world of chronic illness and the possibility of a future where you no longer have symptoms, there's not much else on your mind of what's life like after the symptoms. There's so much belief that once all the symptoms are gone, that's it. That's doesn't matter. But I think it's important to talk about the fact that until you really get to the root of the sense of the one that is resisting life, the resistance just shifts to other things. So that's why for me, I mean, I can't say I stopped caring about recovery because I know it was still what I was working towards, but the kind of belief that that was all that I needed to stop suffering was kind of seen to be just really strong resistance in some sense. And as another form of seeking, I suppose, is seeking that in an imaginary future where all my symptoms are gone, life's going to be perfect. Or it's the same sense of seeking of one day when I have enough money, then I'm going to be satisfied. When I have the perfect partner, then I'm going to be satisfied. When I have whatever, fill in the blank, I will be satisfied. So recovery is just a fill in the blank of the mental seeking mechanism of the mind. And this is why I don't talk about it directly a lot because I struggle to. But that's why I try to talk about awakening, or this kind of idea of getting to the root of identity. Who are you before the mind produces a thought? Who are you without your story? Who are you right now that's hearing this voice? And it's not a thought, and it's not a fact. It's not in thought. And anything that the mind can produce is a thought. And all mental seeking is a thought. And all past and future is a thought. This is my story. This is what's happened to me. This is what I'm struggling with. It's all a thought. And that mechanism is just going to keep on shifting the goalposts of when you're going to be satisfied. So for me, I realized this because the intense suffering of the symptoms and trying to recover and failing and losing everything and not knowing who the fuck I was anymore and where my life was going pushed me onto the spiritual path. And the word spiritual is not necessary, but it does kind of refer to a group of teachings that are talking about a certain truth. But it's not spiritual in the sense that it's about every single human being and how the mind is generating suffering. And it's not an option only to a select group of people. It's an option to you if you're really intent on getting to the roots of your suffering. If you're really intent it doesn't always have to come from suffering. It's probably often a combination of suffering and curiosity. That's how it played out for me. Was I'm suffering so badly, I need to find a way to, and I didn't even think about this at this time, but once I kind of found some spiritual teaching, it was clear, like, oh yeah, I've just kind of been pushed onto this path because there's no other way really, except for me to get to the roots of my kind of internal world that feels so real but an absolute illusion. And then there's the curiosity aspect, which for me was at the same time was like, wait, what the hell is actually going on? Like, when I'm caught up in my thoughts, my problem seems so real. Like, even before chronic illness or whatever we want to call it, like, what's this person going to think of me, and how to fit into the social matrix, and if this person doesn't like me, it's the end of my world, and that kind of those thought patterns that play out, when we're growing up and when we're engaged in social situations. At some point for me, it was like, because this whole thing was falling apart. So all of this kind of identities, all of these real world problems were just like gone. And I was like faced with the truth of my own existence, in a sense that, okay, wait, like all those problems were distracting me all the time. But now that, I'm sitting here, and when I was really sick, there was not a lot going on, and I was getting really interested in philosophy. And I was so interested in physics, and trying to understand, like, how is this conscious experience happening? If I really look at what science has to say, and I really became fascinated with science, because it probably is one of the most robust tools that we have, in the sense that we try really hard to not to kind of test the theories, I suppose, but science has its limits. Anyways, that kind of thing can bring you to a similar investigation, when you realize, okay, yeah, there's all these scientific theories, there's all these philosophical theories, questions, blah, 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 blah. But no story, no like freaking theory is ever going to be sufficient to tell me how the hell am I even here experiencing this? What is this even? And this kind of question can seem absurd when we're really wrapped up in conceptual identity and this conceptual thought-based world where the mind thinks that it knows everything. So it will be like, well, I know what this is. I'm me. This is my story. Blah blah blah. I know what that object is. I know what that object is. I understand that. We can get into complex thought-based stories, right? But it doesn't actually touch what this is. And if you really investigate deeply, like with meditation and inquiry together, like let me see who's noticing the thoughts. Like, there's a thought that it's me. Okay, but that is a thought itself. Like, that is a thought appearing in the conscious space of my mind. But who asked the question? Who's seeing the thought? Who's the one sitting here practicing inquiry? If we're, more in touch with some spiritual stuff, who's the one that's seeking an awakening? Who's the one that decided to meditate? It's not a thought. But investigating, getting curious about what the hell is a thought can be really powerful. Because what is a thought without answering it with a thought? Because we could go, okay, a thought is an idea in the mind I'm experiencing. But what is the experience of a thought? Because those are thoughts themselves. But what isn't a thought? And this will kind of be frustrating and confusing when we're investigating this initially, because we'll be trying to do it through thoughts. We'll be trying to do it from a conceptual, intellectual place. But it's through disidentifying with the thoughts. Okay, that's a thought. This is so confusing. I have no idea what I'm supposed to realize. Okay, that's a thought. Once you start to do this kind of practice, we're like, that's a thought. That's a thought. That's a thought. I'm so bored. I want to go do something else. That's a thought. I'm so sick. I've got all these, I'm never going to recover. That's a thought. I mean, sure, there can be intense physical experience in the body, but whatever the thoughts are saying about it is just a thought. Okay. This is really interesting. Who am I? That's a thought. Who am I without a narrative? For me, that question, who am I without any narrative, just kind of stops the mind in a sense, in that any answer that the mind can give is invalid immediately, because it's okay, well, that's a narrative. Who am I without the narrative? Without any narrative, okay, now I'm in this moment, and now I'm watching a YouTube video. That's all narrative. And in the next moment, I'm going to do that. That's all narrative. What if there's no space for narrative? What's left? This kind of investigation is really transformative, but you have to actually do it. You have to sit down and start investigating your own thoughts. And it's really important. I talk a lot about the emotion work. I talk a lot about how to deal with the symptoms and the emotions around, because when our identities start dissolving for various reasons, maybe through active investigation, maybe through a chronic illness where life kind of just plucks away a lot of the things you used to identify with, and then there's going to be a lot of emotional stuff that was hidden under those identities, that like, well, without this, people are terrified of losing identities, and I'm not trying to say that from a judgmental place. I am people too. But at some point you realize that we're only terrified of losing identity because we were taking that identity to be what we are. But it's so there's a natural kind of fear when that identity crumbles, because it feels like, well, what am I? Like, there's so much need to defend identity, but the need to defend identity is what causes suffering in the first place. I'm trying to defend this thing which isn't really me, and it's so small and flimsy and fragile that it is going to be really scary if I think that's me. That, if somebody attacks my belief, if I can't hold up this belief, that's me. So there's so much fear of losing identity. But once life doesn't give you a choice, or maybe it's through active investigation or whatever, I don't know how somebody ends up on this path. It's the beautiful thing is often it's just kind of life slapping. I've used the term before. It's life tapping you on the shoulder. Well, I didn't come up with that term. Somebody did. Maybe Angelo. Maybe Ajashanti. At some point, life taps you on the shoulder, and it's like it's time to wake up out of this dream you were living in, and you can't really say no, because so I can't remember a friend I was speaking to. I kind of used that term, and he's like, well, it's not really a tap on the shoulder. It's more like a slap on the face, or like beating you with a stick. And I'd say that's accurate, because for me, the way this played out with the chronic illness and the symptoms and all of that was like, I mean, it was intense. And but yeah, this kind of investigation that I was talking about is really important. I mean, it's important as to how willing you are to let go of identity, but the reason I say it's important is it's really difficult to do the emotion work. I mean, it's totally possible, but it's difficult when we identity is still bound up in thought. It's difficult to do the trauma work, the emotion work, the shadow work, when it still feels like the thoughts that pop up in the mind are true and me. So then a thought says, I don't know if I'm accepting this right or if I'm doing this work correctly. And we believe that thought because identity is still there. So that's why this kind of active investigation into thoughts is really key, because we need to stop believing thoughts. That's where all the trouble starts, is you believe the thoughts and then things get confusing because the thoughts will contradict themselves. The thoughts will have the flavor of the emotional work that we haven't done yet. But we need to kind of unbind from the thoughts to then just feel without the narrative. So the thought saying, I can't feel this emotion because of this or this, or every time I do the emotion work, it doesn't work. That's just a thought. And underneath it, there's some feeling of uncertainty or fear or doubt or whatever. But we need to be able to let the thought be the thought, but not believe it, because as soon as we believe it, we're going to be believing the next thought. And then the next thought might say, you know what, I can't do this work anymore. I need to go and do something else. And there's such a stark difference between that's a thought. I can just sit here and see that that's a thought. And then the next thought can come out saying, oh, I don't want to sit here 1 minute longer. It's too difficult. And that's a thought. Okay, but what is the thought about? Or like, what is the thought reacting to? That will be like an experience physically, probably. Like that would be the emotion work, or the acceptance work that I talk about, the non-resistance work. Like, what don't I want to feel? So when that thought comes up, then let's question it. That thought saying, this is too uncomfortable. Okay, well, what's it actually about? That's just a thought. I don't need to believe the thought. The thought is just kind of a narrative on top of an intense physical experience. But what actually happens if I just keep sitting? If I go towards the place the thoughts are telling me not to go towards? What happens if I feel that emotion that the thoughts have been telling me I mustn't feel? Like for me, it would be whenever there's kind of feeling of loneliness around, like relationship ending. That was a big deal for me during this whole journey that I really struggled with. The thoughts would always be like, oh no, we mustn't feel this anymore. It's been so long. You shouldn't feel loneliness. And then through doing this kind of inquiry work that I learned from Angelo DeLullo and reading his book, Awake, I was like, no, I need to feel the emotion. Like, it's okay to feel the emotion. And then the thought would say the next thing, like, don't, whatever. But once I was like, oh, wait, that's a thought. That's a thought. What if I just feel it? It's a vastly different, you're much more able to do the work, because often the thoughts believing the thoughts are the barriers. So, I mean, this whole video was all over the place, but I feel like that's sometimes better, is just kind of, I don't know, talking about whatever. So yeah, I mean, I really recommend some kind of inquiry practice where you can disidentify from the thoughts. And for this kind of thing, I really recommend, for me, Angelo DeLullo and his book, Awake, It's Your Turn, were the most helpful guide and teacher through this process of disidentifying with the mind and realizing that that's where all the suffering is, and it's not necessary to live from that space. It's completely possible, and then it's much easier to work through the resistance patterns. And to just circle back to where this whole video started, was what's life like after recovery. That's for me where a lot of the work is now, is there's lots of, I mean, sometimes there's really intense stuff that has a really intense physical component as well. After those kind of identities are completely seen through, then a lot of resistance work is needed to be done, because now we can actually see the stuff we were hiding from ourselves. That, oh my gosh, I'm seeking validation from everybody around me. Oh my gosh, I'm afraid to be authentic in this situation. Oh my gosh, all of this stuff that we wouldn't have been able to see when we were bound up in the thoughts, because the thought would we'd be using a thought to hide that from ourselves, something like that. So yeah, the work can be challenging, but eventually there's no other choice. Like, I can't stop doing the work now because I'll just suffer then. And I've tried sometimes, more from like a realizing that I'm distracting myself. But sometimes I'll be like, well, what if I just kind of distract myself, and it gets more and more uncomfortable physically and mentally as the thoughts become more kind of catchy again. And then it's like, wait, if I just sit and meditate and notice the thoughts and accept what's in the body that I was kind of resisting, it all kind of returns back to like, wait, that suffering that seemed to kind of be like, oh, there's a problem. It's like, wait, that was just thoughts. So yeah, for me, it's really important to keep, I've experimented with, periods of being busy and stuff, but whenever I introduce more time to sit and explore and meditate and inquire and do the acceptance work, there's just, things are much better. So yeah, maybe that will help you to do the work if you're struggling to, but often it has to come from within, where we're just like, I can't keep distracting myself, it's not working. Been down that road a million times. And for me, that's where like a small decision to like, okay, in this moment, I'm feeling stress build up, I'm feeling resistance build up, I'm feeling physical experiences build up. Then in my recovery journey, this became such an important fork in the road. It was like, either I can go down the path of avoidance and distraction, and I've done that a million times, or I can stop and sit for 10 minutes or 20 minutes or whatever, and just making that small decision. Like, okay, well, I'm just going to sit now because I've been down that road. It doesn't work. And just doing that consistently, that really started to change everything for me. It was like, yeah, I could see in the past I would have gone down this whole road where things get worse and worse and worse with more distraction. And, there would be these big cycles. Or each time now I'm making this little decision. I'm like, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to do this instead. No, I'm not going to distract myself in that way. I'm going to do this instead. That became really important. And it's surprisingly easy and difficult at the same time. Like, you realize that all you have to do is lean into the more uncomfortable choice. So it's like, yeah, that's what my mind wants to do because it's going to distract me from the uncomfortable. But I know now that I need to lean into the uncomfortable. So it's a really simple choice, but we really have to get to that point where we're willing to feel the uncomfortableness. So that's something as well. But I guess I'll leave it there. Just, it's worth doing the work, I suppose. And it's okay to unbind completely from all identity. The mind can say a million things why you shouldn't. And this is why I like Angelo's book so much, because it kind of will help you to see through any trap that we could fall for of the mind. It's really helpful. But yeah, I'll leave it at that.